kind of started it a year ago, just a community space for people to pop in and share ideas, and that's kind of evolved into, when it works, to have a special presenter or a special guest. Last month we had Dr. Cavello, and today we're thrilled that Dr. Timothy Coombs is joining us. Tim, if you're okay, I'm not going to read your bio here. I'll just intro you by saying Tim Coombs is one of the smartest guys I know, and especially in the field of crisis communications. And he is arguably one of the world leading researchers, professors, and academics in the crisis communication space, going right back to, when did you start? I think you started kicking this thing around 1995.
Yeah, 95.
Which is when this whole your crisis communications, situational crisis communication theory, and how that's kind of evolved into more just all of these ideas, and your research, your books, your articles, how it's continued to shape and influence crisis communication practitioners. And we were kind of alluding to it. I teach at a couple universities, and wherever I go, we use your books, because your books is kind of this it's the standard in crisis and risk communications. And so we're thrilled to have you here. A bunch of folks have popped in questions, and maybe I'll try something different this time, and that's just calling them out and just asking them to pop on their camera and their mic and just ask you a question. And then those questions, I think, will inspire more conversation. The intent behind these is, just imagine we're all having coffee together and having some good conversation. That said, let's not trip over each other's mics. So if you do want to pipe in and have something to say, just put it in the chat box, and either Jeff and I will call you and just say, hey, I'm going to pick on you, Dana, because you're right in my window right next door. Hey, Dana, yeah, go ahead, right? So with that said, do you want to say anything, Tim, or do you just want to get right to it?
Yeah, we could just start with the questions. That'd be good.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question right out of the chute, and it goes right back to situational crisis communication theory. And if you could just briefly explain that theory and how you think that theory is, I'm really curious on the tie-in and the connection to what we've seen during this past year of political leaders, health decision makers, because I think that SCCT is really going to have an impact on I think here in Alberta anyway, our politicians, and how people might feel when they are faced with something similar. And I also really think that the response to COVID in the past year, I think the SCCT is playing a role in the vaccination messaging that's going on right now. So that was much more than I meant to ask, but can you explain SCCT and then how you see that playing out today?
Well, the theory kind of began because when you're looking, and this was in the early days of crisis management, before a lot was written about it. And you see a lot of things, people talking about, like, oh, there are all these crisis types over here, and there's all these possible responses, but there was no way to connect the two up. And one of the things we know from generally in communication literature is the situation matters. The situation impacts what makes for an effective message you're trying to get it across. So it made sense that would be then part of what affects the effectiveness of a crisis message is the situation and the nature of the crisis. And that was kind of the beginning point of it, to try to identify how responses might vary across different situations. But also along the way, we kind of found, what a starting point for all that, what works in all situations. And that's when we identified the idea that what we now call the ethical-based response, the instructing and adjusting information, is what you have to do first. You need to tell people what to do to protect themselves physically and to help them cope psychologically. And that's the key. And this goes back to the writings of a lot of the early practitioners, that you really have to have empathy for the people involved in the crisis. And when you lose that, that's when you have a bad crisis response. So we're starting with that as the base. And then from, then you might need to add. Some crises aren't that difficult. It's hard, it's odd to say that okay, I'm in a crisis, so it's inherently bad, but some are worse than others, and some are fairly easy to manage if you do things right, if you take care of those things. So I think right now with JBS, they had the problem where they had the cyber attack, and it's been a disruption to meat across the world, shortages and so forth, and prices going up. If you look at their responses, they're very good because they're identifying really a lot of instructing and adjusting information. That's where the focus needs to be, because there's not really anything they did wrong. I mean, they had good systems, they were hacked, and even though that can create some problems for an organization long term, they're handling it very well in their messaging because they're focusing on those victims. And then, when things get worse, and worse being interpreted in terms of crisis responsibility, because that becomes a focal part coming out of attribution theory. Who do you feel is responsible for this crisis? Is it the organization or some other entity? That's when you need to layer in a more accommodative responses. And that's really focused on sort of giving compensation to victims and or an apology along with the victims. And what we've been doing more recently is identifying the limits of that. So we've always, I remember reading pieces where it's just been a horrific crisis, and someone writes, if they had only apologized, things would be fine. I'm like, no, it's some crisis is never going to be fine. And we began to identify the limits of that. And once you press past those limits, the recommendations are still good recommendations, but you're not going to see any immediate effect from them. Instead, you're looking at more of a long-term investment of trying to kind of turn around the damage that's been done to your organization. But in really extreme crises, you're not going to get the immediate effect on, say, I'm going to be able to show that their purchase intention hasn't been harmed as much, or it's done less damage to my reputation. That's all just going to disappear. But instead, you're investing more long-term in with your relationship, particularly with trying to restore the notion that there's a value congruence with your stakeholders, because really extreme crises have a risk of shattering that, because the people look at your organization and say, wow, that's just not me. That's not who I am. You've done something really bad. And those really extreme ones, for the most part, have a strong moral component to it, that the company knew what they were doing. They knew it was wrong, or at least some people in the organization who did it knew it was wrong. And it's just this complete moral violation that people find very troubling. And that goes back to some of the research in psychology that finds that people are okay when you do something wrong and it's incompetence. But when it's a moral one where you chose to do it, that creates whole new problems for relationships that exist. So that's sort of where what we were trying to do with SCCT was to get a more nuanced approach to crisis communication, and to really try to show with experimental studies that what works and what doesn't work. That this isn't just speculation, but a lot of this, you can say in most cases this will work. Will it work all the time? No, because this is social scientific research. We're not like physics or chemistry. We don't get the same result, 999 times out of 1,000. It's more probabilistic in communication. That's always been the case. If you look at the persuasion research, what works in persuasion is not a given. And that's why for very long, for decades, PRSA in the United States tells people, do not guarantee results. It's a probability that this is going to work, and you do what you think is most likely to work, not that it will always work. That's kind of the thinking behind it. And I think kind of tying it back in with the COVID response is most of the COVID failures were a failure to really think about people and to put the people first, the people who could be victims of all of this. And instead of thinking about other things, thinking about political careers, thinking about economic impact and lifting those above the human side of it, really took things in bad directions. I know it took it in really bad directions here in the US. And other countries didn't. They said, no, this is about protecting the people, and they did what it takes to protect the people. So I think that's key part of it.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a lot of alignment between your research and your theories and ideas and the emergency management aspect of it. I know Greg Selecki and Josh Bowen are in here, but when you think about emergency management or EM priorities, you put people first, right? People, infrastructure, environment, economy, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's amazing. And then I also love, Jeff, you heard it from Timothy, don't make guarantees. And say it, Jeff, because there's a couple of my students in here.
Ben's favorite word is ensure. Don't ever use the word ensure.
Unless you're talking about the supplement drink.
Right. Because as he reminds me all the time, it actually means guarantee. So we're going to guarantee this never happens again. All right.
Yeah, well, look at Johnson & Johnson learned the hard way. Johnson & Johnson, after the first product tampering, came up with a tamper-proof packaging, which quickly became tamper-resistant when they had their second installment of the product tampering. Yeah.
Resistant, love it. That's great. Thanks, Tim. Diane, I'm going to toss it to you if you want to pose it over.
Okay, so the fun part is when you write your question in and then you send it in, it disappears. So I'm going to try and remember more or less what I was going to ask. And I think there's probably a lot of people who don't know me. I actually came across the coffee chat. I was a longtime public relations practitioner in Canada, worked at the RCMP. You would probably call it the Mounties, Tim, is my guess. At National Defense and other places. I retired 3 years ago and started my PhD in communication. And I teach part-time. And if all things align, I'll be teaching crisis communications this winter. So I'm reading, I have read some of your stuff, but I'm continuing to read it as I prepare for that, hopefully. But my question was really, and I'm sure you've probably been asked this question before, but it's really around the crisis communications around COVID. And it seems to me one of the particular challenges we faced with this is the number of spokespersons, the number of messages, the cognitive dissonance between the messages here in Canada, for example, from one province to another, from one city to another. I mean, has what's been going on changed anything in terms of how you think of these things, or what are the learnings for us around communicating when you're dealing with a global crisis where there are so many spokespersons and so many messages?
That's a really good point, because we saw that in the US. Essentially, we had no national policy, so we had what was initially sort of 50 states responding differently, and then within states that began to fracture. What it does is it reinforces something that goes back to really emergency management to a large degree, and the advice in crisis communication that you need to speak with one voice. And you also when you look at the structure, FEMA here in the US has some of its problems, but it developed the National Incident, the NIMS, National Incident Management System. And it talks about that need to integrate. And I've done some other projects that are more sort of just kind of public relations oriented. And again, one of the keys is you need to coordinate the communication aspect of it. And I think what COVID did is reinforce that need to coordinate and to cooperate, sharing information, sharing messaging, so that you don't have to give the exact same message. It's not that everyone has the same talking points, but they have the same basic information to draw upon and talk from, so that you don't get these conflicting messages. The COVID just reinforces how problematic that is for people, because think of something as simple as the mask mandate: wear a mask, not wear a mask. And in the US, first we were told, oh, don't worry about the mask. Well, that was a pragmatic decision made because first responders needed masks and there weren't enough masks to go around. So they told people, don't worry about masks. Well, when there were enough masks available, then they tell people wear masks, and people are like, well, you just told me I didn't need them. And that created a resistance point from the very beginning. And those people anchored into that and had resisted masks for the whole time. And now that we're starting to come out of it, there was a quick push to get rid of masks. And now the CDC has kind of backed that, saying, oh yeah, if you're vaccinated, you don't need a mask. And all people hear is, I don't need a mask. They don't hear like, well, if you're not vaccinated, you should still be wearing a mask. Because while the numbers overall in the US are falling, if you take them and you pull out a subset of the people who are not vaccinated, their rates are just as bad as it was during the worst part of the COVID pandemic in the United States. Their rates of contracting it and hospitalizations are still very high. So I think it really, again, going back to the point, it created that need for consistency, because we're still suffering from an inconsistent messaging at the start that plagued us throughout the entire process. And that happens. And it just shows that we need to think about coordination. And the best way to think about coordination is preparation. That you train, and you train on this stuff, and you train for these large scale types of events and how to work and how to coordinate together. Because again, we know that from emergency management, that working together is what builds that coordination. Because if you've never really worked with someone before, and this is the first time, that's rough. And it's going to be a bit of a learning curve as you can get over through the training process. So I think that's the important lesson, is really the need for coordination and more of an emphasis on training on these larger scale types of events, which we have known were there and could happen, but for various reasons chose not to do. And particularly troubling in the United States that a year prior to COVID-19, they ran a simulation. It was Crimson something. It essentially was that some type of virus variant comes out of Asia and impacts the US and the global economy. And they did horribly on it. They scored very poorly, and there were all these recommendations about what needed to be done. It was just ignored. No one paid any mind to it. And a year later, they're in that crisis. Had they paid even a small amount of attention and began working on what they had learned through their training sessions and their failures there, it would have been a different outcome and potentially could have saved upwards of tens of thousands of lives if they had been ready for it. Again, you need that through your preparation and your training, and that's going to help with the coordination.
What about in the moment? Sorry, can I ask a follow-up with that? Is that okay?
You sure can.
What about in the moment? Because it seems to me what people are dealing with now, or what we're seeing now, is more trust issues around, because people don't understand why certain decisions are being made and not others. So why do I not have to wear a mask at the park versus I have to wear it somewhere else? What do you think that those who are sending the messages are missing there, that's creating that trust gap?
Oddly, I think people need more consistent messaging. And I don't think people are good at understanding some of these subtle differences that are being made. And I think there's a need to err on caution and say, no, we really should be doing this all the time and not just some of the time. Because while, yes, the data might say, oh, if I'm outside, things are a little bit different. That's not what people hear. And one of Cavello's points is always to keep the risk communication simple. And when I start saying, here it works here, over here it doesn't, here things are a little bit different, that's a much more complicated message. And we're probably better off just telling people, no, you wear it all the time. And again, I would rather see an error on caution than to try and create sort of another arguing point that people have for not wearing the mask. Because we saw that in the United States when people they picked up whoa, I can go outside, I don't need to wear it, so why am I wearing it inside? Yeah. We can get into the science of that, but people don't want to hear science.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Diane. Hey, Mark.
Hello.
Let's see you, and let's go ahead and ask Tim what you're thinking.
Great, thanks for the opportunity here. I'm wondering if, sorry, I'm just getting an echo, but I'm wondering if crisis communications has almost become too good and that a lot of organizations are now just saying the right thing but not doing the right thing, and they see a crisis as being able just to brush people off, basically coming down to like the worst image of what public relations is. And then related to that previous question, you're going to have a trust gap because people are won't trust organizations that are just saying the right thing but not doing the right thing.
I think that's a very valid concern, because when I think of crisis communication, I think of communication as words and action combined. Because I know sometimes it's viewed as just the words, and I think that's what organizations oftentimes are just going to rely upon the words. And the idea is, I can buy myself time. I'm going to say the right things here up front, but I'm not going to do what matters long term. An illustration of that was when things kind of reached a peak sort of last year with the Black Lives Matters movement here in the US. A lot of companies made statements about what they were going to do to address this disparity, this structural inequity. Well, they needed to back those up with actions. What are they doing now? So that's the next question to ask is, well, what are you actually doing? Particularly in a crisis, when you've had a very serious crisis, so one that's had a pretty major impact upon people's lives. One of the points about adjusting information should help them cope psychologically. And part of that is, I'm telling you what I'm going to do in the future to prevent this from occurring. We've called that corrective action. I think curative is probably a better term. What am I doing so that we're less likely to have this problem in the future? Because that's what you're thinking about. When you read about, there's a problem with the Boeing 747 MAX, you want to know if they fix this before you fly on a Boeing 747 MAX. So there's this anxiety that goes with it. And organizations who just take that surface approach, as you pointed out, aren't going to do that. They're not going to follow up. They're not going to then bring forward and say, hey, this is what we have done. These are the actions we have taken. They're just going to make these promises. And I find that very troubling. And in fact, I've written this piece that's critical of some forms of crisis communication that go that direction, that don't want to talk about and wrestle with the tough issues, but instead like, oh, everything's going to be good in the future. Everything is going to be nice. Just let's think about this bright and happy future. It's like, well, I don't know that you fixed your problems. I don't know that you've done anything for this. So you're just going to distract me with this, and you're not really going to be accountable. And I think accountability is a key component of that. And, I talked about, crisis responsibility, but the more I look at it, it's not just responsibility, but it's also accountability. And that accountability needs the action part of that, because my words say, this is what I'm going to do, but my actions say, well, did I really do it or not? So you're right, that needs to be backed up, because there's enough advice out there for people to kind of slide by on, let's just say, kind of a surface response. And they know that, okay, now the media is going to lose interest. They're going to go away. No one's really going to do a follow-up to see what I'm really doing. But your stakeholders will know. But you're getting a pass anyway, initially. A good example of that, the brand is about gone now because Coca-Cola is phasing it out, is Odwalla. When Odwalla had its foodborne illness outbreak in the 90s, it was hailed as, oh, they were so wonderful. They were one of the first to use not social media, use the internet, because before social media, and how wonderful they were. And oh, look at this. And they talked about this nice, bright future for everyone. Well, then it comes out in the court documents that they knew the risks all along, that they made these choices to engage in riskier behavior that they knew would allow foodborne illness into the supply chain. One of the best pieces of evidence was that the government forbade the sale of Odwalla products on military bases because they thought it could compromise military preparedness because of an outbreak of a foodborne illness. And there was even internal documentation about their new safety manager wanting to change their use of a chlorine wash to a much more effective type of wash. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. What we have is good enough. When they knew it was like somewhere around like 10% effective in terms of it. They were banking on never having any foodborne illness on the materials they were putting into their drinks, which is a very risky proposition to say like, oh yeah, none of your fruit ever touched the ground. No one ever snuck something into it along those lines. And so when you look at it, they knowingly put people at risk. They created this problem, but the media didn't pay attention to that part of the story. And if you look in most textbooks, they will hail Oddwall as this great response, when actually it was not a great response. It was, as you're pointing, it was a very just bunch of words that were out there. They didn't put anything behind it. What really was behind it was a lack of safety that created their problems for them. But again, they get a pass because they gave nice flowery words like, oh, the future will be better. We'll have this product and everyone's going to be happy. And they just didn't back it up. And I think that action needs to be there. And the more serious the crisis, the more extreme it is, I think the more you need the action there behind. You got to tell us what's going on. These extreme crises where you have these moral violations, you've got to explain to people, not just the nice surface apology, but you need to explain to them that you understand what you did wrong. And you don't see that in apologies. That's not required in an apology. You'll say like, oh, we're sorry. We'll be like, oh, like, we're sorry, we offended you, without getting into understanding why what you do was offensive. You need to explain that you understand what you do is wrong, because that's how you're going to fix it. Because you can't just say, oh yeah, sorry, we offended you, we won't do it again, when I don't really know what you did. You got to give me the steps for it. And that's why it's always important when there's an investigation after a crisis, that those investigative results are made public by the organization, and the organization then says how it's going to address the recommendations in that investigation. Yeah, you can dance around it, and we see organizations do that, and sometimes they get away with it just by the words they use.
Well, thank you for the answer. It actually leads to more questions. When you talk about the investigative power of media, and then also the temporary amount of time that leaders have in an organization, so they're often self-interested. And then lastly, what the responsibilities are of crisis communicators when they're facing this situation. But I'll leave it to for other people to ask their questions. Thank you.
Mark, those will be great conversations for one of our collaborate sessions. That'd be awesome. Josh, if you want to pop on, but Josh, I'd appreciate it if you gave a little bit of an intro of yourself and what you do and where you are, because I think Timothy would find that really interesting. So would everybody else in the room, actually, because you're not just a name, you're a pretty big deal.
Thank you. I don't know about that necessarily, but I'll take your word for it. So Ben has just ensured that I'm a big deal. So I'm kidding. My name is Josh Bowen. I'm an instructor in the Disaster and Emergency Management Program at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. And Ben, we've known each other for what, 4 or 5 years now-ish?
You're much more than an instructor, Josh. Come
on. I've just spent the last year leading Nate's response to the COVID crisis, and through that help the entire post-secondary sector in here in Alberta, across Canada, and across the States as well. So it's been a fun ride. So I'm really excited to get back to the classroom and apply some of that. One of the things that you brought up, Dr. Coombs, is that you sort of referenced the Event 201, that pandemic exercise that was put on by Johns Hopkins and the World Economic Forum and the Gates Foundation. And at the end of it, everybody was like, there's a whole lot of things that we need to do better. Glad that's a black swan and it doesn't matter. So let's kind of just, throw it off on the side of the room, and we can deal with the more important things like fires and tornadoes and floods and blah, blah, blah. How do we better communicate these black swan events in a way that people say, yeah, the risk of this happening is very low, but when it does, oh my goodness, the entire world closes down, and we need to be aware of it. And then I have a follow-up about the sort of the great term I just heard about, a black elephant. So it's a black swan event that is also the elephant in the room, like climate change, those kinds of things. So how do we engage in risk communication proactively to sort these things out?
And another term that's used is the gray rhino. But the gray rhino is there, and you know it's there, but you choose not to see the gray rhino. And pandemics have kind of been that way. I mean, I've been, I mean, going back to the early 2000s, I remember seeing sessions at professional organizations on contingency and disaster management about pandemics that were out there. And I think what we need to do is focus on the impact aspect of it, because it's the likelihood that allows people to push it off. But the best way is to think of it as analogous to the airline industry. Very unlikely to have a plane crash, yet that is probably the one crisis that they know a lot about, and they share resources when one occurs, and they are ready and prepared to do that. But the odds are really, really light. I mean, that's why we're all willing to fly on planes, because they don't fall out of the sky very often. And we need to start thinking, bring that type of thinking to pandemic types of situations, whether they're, you know, a minor case, which was more on the case with SARS, or something major that we have now with COVID-19, but to talk about the impact and not so much upon the likelihood. That's why when I talk about impact and likelihood, I like to look at it as multiplicative. You multiply it instead of adding it together. Because if you're on a scale of 1 to 10, the highest you can get is 20. But if you multiply it, you get a bigger range. And I think you start to see that, yeah, this impact is so bad, it really needs to be addressed. And I think that's where we need to go with the risk communication, is to talk about the impact that can be there. Because that's one of the key components that, you know, when the people are making assessments about risk messaging, is this idea like, well, how bad will this be for me? And you want to say, yeah, this could be really bad, because, and then you're gonna say, well, if this is very unlikely, it's like, yeah, well, but maybe we underestimate the likelihood of it. Maybe the likelihood is now higher, and those estimates might be increasing for us to kind of think about this. Because I think at the very beginning, when you look at one of the prominent theories in risk, which is the extended parallel process model, people think like, can this happen to me, and will it be bad? And early on, I think in the pandemic, people were like, oh, well, it's just the flu, and this is never going to happen to me. And then they started seeing like, no, this isn't just the flu. This is something a lot worse. And yeah, this could happen to you, because most people, I think their lives were touched in some way by the virus. And I think we have to build upon that in future arguments, talking about the impact and really focusing on the impact part of it, saying if it's likely, it should matter. It's interesting, because when it comes to the pandemic, people are willing to dismiss a small probability. Yet based upon small probabilities, they will go out and buy lottery tickets. Saying, oh yeah, my chances of winning the lottery. Well, your chances of getting the virus are much greater than you winning the lottery. I mean, there's a lot more virus victims than there are lottery winners. Although now in Ohio, they're combining the two. If you get vaccinated, you get entered into a lottery. But we need to start thinking about that, saying like, no, this is a possibility. And that has somehow been lost when you get to probability, because most of the time when you tell people probability, they think possibility, but I don't know why in the pandemic that reversed on us. That was quite strange to see that happen. Because most of the time you tell people, oh, you got a 1 in a million chance. They say, oh, I've got a chance of getting this. And that's why they don't like risks. But I think we really need to start talking about impacts and just be more upfront with people that these things are real and possible. These are not just something on a science out of a movie or a novel. These are real, and now we have a good reference point for it to show us what it can be.
Thanks.
But yeah, the danger with impact is that you can't go too far with it, because you have to talk about impact, but you also have to say what they can do to prevent it, and you couple those two when you talk about impact. And so like, yeah, this is bad, but we have ways to deal with it. And again, the pandemic shows a lot of the social distancing measures work. They did what they should do. And so you need to couple those two. And I almost forgot to say that, because if you just tell people things are really bad, sometimes they can just ignore your message, say it's bad, but we can do some pretty simple things to keep ourselves safe and to move forward on this. And so those
Great.
do need to be coupled together.
And I think that's where the idea of risk perception and risk tolerance come into play, because you can have this, everybody can have the same risk, but your individual perception of that risk and your individual tolerance of that risk is all the same. I think about when I went to Las Vegas with my buddies just before COVID, and we all understood the general risks of putting money on the table. So we all had the general perception of what we were doing. I was willing to risk $20, and my buddy was willing to risk 1,000 because he believed, you know, his knowledge and understanding reduced the level of risk for him. So he had a different perception, and his tolerance was obviously very different. And there's a great clip from the movie Dumb and Dumber. I don't know if you remember that one with Ace Ventura, was his Jim Carrey. And he finally gets the woman, and he's like, "What do you think, Mary? What's the chance of a guy like me being with a woman like you?" And she says, "Not good." And he's like, "What do you mean not good? Like 1 in 100?" And she says, "More like 1 in a million." And then his face just lights up, and he's like, "So you're telling me there's a chance?" And that's all he can focus on. Right? It's a great clip to demonstrate that risk tolerance and risk perception. Thanks. I think we'll go to Kaijo.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is a very, very interesting conversation. I just wanted to go back a little bit to what Mark was saying about, saying the right thing and not doing the right thing. And if you could comment a little bit more on leadership and how that is affecting the communication aspect. And a couple of examples is we've seen throughout the world problems when top leaders, top management people go on vacation, even if they've told the whole public not to do it. You know, we've seen it in Texas, we've seen it in the Netherlands, we've seen it in Sweden. And we had a very interesting case in Norway during Easter. The Norwegian Prime Minister, she has done a very good job most of the time. And she's been telling people, not to go outside, not to have people in your house and things like that. And then during Easter, she had invited 12 people to a sushi party. And she was fined by the police, and people said that if she can do it, I can do it. And I think it's just strange that they do these things and they don't think more about the aspect of communicating the right thing and doing the right thing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a problem you see generally. And when you talk to crisis managers, they'll tell you horror stories about the CEO, how he or she undid all their good work, that the crisis team was ready and had all this stuff, and they had this very good response effort plan, and then the CEO throws it all out the window by deciding to go in their own direction. And that's a risk. We see it quite a bit among US CEOs, and just recently had a discussion about this with some other group related to crisis management, that a lot of the CEOs are difficult to work with. And this was in regards to media training, because they don't listen to anyone anymore. He or she they're at the top of their game, and so they think it doesn't matter, and the rules don't apply to them. We see that with business leaders, we see that with athletes, we see that with politicians, that the rules of the people who I am supposed to be working with or for don't apply to me, because I'm at this other level and I'm beyond these sorts of rules. And that's very troubling to see. But yeah, you've mentioned that globally you see this, and it's very unfortunate. You see it in corporations, you see it in politics as well. Like when you're in the middle of a storm where your constituents are dying because they don't have electricity, and Cruz decides to go on vacation to Mexico, and then he blames his daughter for it. Oh, well, she wanted to go. It's like, oh, you could have had your family go, and you could have stayed behind and worked. You could have done that. But there's just this sense of this entitlement that many leaders have, that they're above it all. And it gets to deal with sort of egos that they have. That's unfortunate. Again, that can lead organizations and countries in bad directions when the ego goes. I mean, most of what we suffered in the United States was due to the ego of leadership, not to anything else. I mean, he was willing to subvert science and willing to gut our Centers for Disease Control and neutralize them and twist words and reinterpret data in ways that, you know, no scientific expert would ever agree with, but because that's what they felt like doing. And that's very difficult to counteract if there's no one in an organization or in a government who can stand up and push back against those.
You were talking earlier about the intent, whether an organization is culpable or mischievous, right? Or whether they intended to do something or whether it was a circumstance. And just in that about leadership in Canada, we had, Jeff, do you remember, was it a minister or somebody who took pictures of themselves in front of the fireplace with the stockings hung by the fire with care and pre-scheduled the tweets to go out at Christmas, on Christmas Day, to make it look like they were at home by their fireplace when they were actually away in a hot vacation spot. So you add that kind of element of, hey, I'm telling you, asking you to do one thing, I'm going to do another. And then I'm going to maliciously attempt to fool you to make you think that I was actually doing what I was supposed to be doing. Crazy.
Tim, I'm also old enough to remember the Ford Pinto, the exploding gas tanks, and I wonder if you could just talk about that, because as I recall, they knew the gas tanks were going to explode, and the lawyer said, look, it's going to cost less from the families that sue us and the damages we have to pay out than it would to redesign the car, so let's just leave it. And I mean, in the end, I think they were wrong. It cost them a lot more, including the reputational hit.
Yeah, they really did a miscalculation, because on the 2 points, they didn't factor in what the reputational damage would be, and they didn't factor in how much people were really going to get from juries as a award on that. They really undersold it, because it was the fact that the Pinto actually was Lee Iacocca's car, and the idea was, you know, this shows you when it occurred. It was to cost under $2,000 and weigh less than 2,000 pounds. And they identified the problem ahead of time, and there were two potential fixes that they could do. They could insert a bladder into the gas tank, or they could change sort of the angle of the gas tank. They had two options, and they said, well, either one was going to put us over $2,000. So, we're gonna blow our budget. It's not going to be an under $2,000 car. We want to keep it under 2,000. That's when the lawyer said, litigation's cheaper, because here's what it's going to cost to fix it, and here's what it's going to cost to litigate. And they were completely wrong on their litigation numbers for it. And the reputational damage, I don't think you can calculate it. That it turns out like, oh yeah, you knew this car could explode. Granted, it had to be just the right conditions, an accident from behind, but it's not as if there were only one or two of them. This was happening pretty frequently with the Pinto. You know, when you look at frequency of numbers from accidents and so forth. I mean, far higher than when you later saw with the Firestone tires, with the blowouts, the Bridgestone tires on the Ford car,
the Explorer,
the Explorer. So that's and so Ford knowingly did this, and they put everyone at risk. And again, that's one of those ones that creates this kind of moral outrage and this backlash. You're like, well, how could you do it? You care nothing about us. You didn't care at all. This was all about your profit. You know, it's profit over people and what you're doing. You need to think about it. And I don't know. I mean, Ford's only hope of recovery was that eventually people would forget about the Pinto and forget about the things that are going on, because there's nothing they could say or do really to rebuild trust. It was very hard for them to even begin talking about that, because no one would believe them. They took such a bad option for it. And so they were in trouble with that type of crisis. And you contrast that with something like COVID, where no one's responsible for COVID, but you are responsible for the performance, how you perform. And when you think about crises, there's responsibility, who's responsible for this, but you have some crises where there's really no one's responsible for it. But there's always going to be the performance aspect. And that's where you're going to get evaluated. How well did you perform? Did you come through? And I've always argued that that's sort of one of the differences between politicians and corporations. Corporations are most of the time managing crises they created themselves in one way or another. The product went bad, an employee did something wrong, there was an issue for them. Politicians are usually managing crises that aren't their fault, but they still have to come in and they have to perform. And they and their corporate counterparts share that performance component of it. Because people like to say a crisis is both a threat and an opportunity. Well, every crisis is a threat because it brings harm and danger to people. The opportunity is always your performance. If you perform well, that's what people remember, that you performed very well and you came through for people in the end, as opposed to performing badly and making it worse. And that's often the worst case scenarios where you engage in a crisis intervention and you make it worse. It's like, just don't talk anymore. It's like, that's when it's like, yeah, silence would have been better. Not saying anything would have been better for you than speaking. Because I remember when, it was during Megantic. And they said every time the CEO of the railroad spoke, he made it worse. And that was one of the headlines in one of the major business publications. Like, yeah, just stay quiet.
That's, yeah, that like Megantic, I think, will be one that will be remembered for a long time. One of those cases of, if you're going to show up late like that, just don't show up. You're probably better off. We've got one more question, Tim, but before we do that, I just want to say that we're super thrilled that Dr. Timothy Coombs is joining the advisory board of our center, the Center for Crisis and Risk Communications. And so we are so thrilled to be working with you and being mentored by you and guided by you. And we're just going to tease this out a little bit, but our team here and Dr. Coombs and Dr. Cavello are working on a couple projects over the summer that we'll be coming out with in the fall, all about learning, all about crisis and risk communication learning opportunities for organizations and people wherever they lie. So basically, if you or your organization is looking for an opportunity to learn from two of arguably, I always say it, if you've heard me before, I call Cavello a godfather of crisis and risk communications, and I call Timothy the great uncle. Some of the most brilliant minds in crisis and risk communications are teaming up with us to help guide us, our work. Everything that we do and is grounded in the research and the teaching of Cavello and Coombs. And so thrilled to be working on a couple projects with you guys that we'll be bringing out in the fall. So just wanted to tease that out today for this group of Crisis and Coffee folks, how thrilled we are and grateful, Tim. We're very, very grateful that you've said, yeah, I'm in. So that's, we're so lucky.
Yeah, I'm happy to work with you all. And yeah, and Vincent goes back to 3 Mile Island and some of the very early risk work.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's very humbling for us. So with that said, back to you, Diane, and then if anybody else has any last minute questions, just feel free to let us know in the chat box there.
Nope, I didn't have another question. So
perhaps
someone else.
Dana, that might have been me actually.
Sorry, yeah, that's Dana. Sorry, Diana.
Well, thanks again for hosting. This is always very informative, and thank you, Dr. Coombs, for all of the great information you've provided. But I just had a bit of a follow-up question, I guess, to Josh's question that he asked earlier. And it's with regards to, we talked a little bit about black swan events, the elephant in the room, the gray rhinoceros, and you mentioned that quite often politicians are sort of faced with crises that they need to deal with and sort out. There will, I think, always be politicians who put their ambition and their careers ahead of things. Going forward, based on all of your research, going forward, do you think now that this black swan event has actually happened, governments, organizations might take a more proactive approach to, Ben, I can't remember what the order of your, but planning, preparing, and practicing for Black Swan events. Do you think there might be a more proactive approach to be better prepared and ready to handle things that, you know, we think are never going to happen to us?
Yeah, I hope the politicians will. The evidence from the business world is that you're seeing a pretty significant adoption of preparedness now. And one of the things that we know from research in a number of different disciplines that look at crisis is that organizations do better the second time around. First time they have a crisis, they got to work through it, it's kind of rough. And the second time, most of the time they do well. And the smart ones do really well on it because they learn and they learn from those lessons. And we see that. And, you know, I've worked just with some units within my university for preparing for if there's a virus surge, because they now have an idea of what they need to do. And now they're refining that. And we talked about what worked and what didn't work and what they need to do for the next round. And from what I'm reading in, you know, from coming out of people in risk management, people in crisis management, is that's the general sense among people in crisis communication, people in risk management, that they're going to be different in the future. They're going to be better prepared in the future. They're going to see more resources going towards preparation because now they know that this is a reality. And yeah, it's now something that needs to be on their radar because it can easily, now they can see like, all right, well, the virus mutates and there's a surge. What do we do with that? Oh, okay, we're prepared. We have alternative business models in place. We already have alternative models for employees. We can refine those now. And so that when it happens, we can switch almost instantaneously instead of, you know, however long it takes. On the university setting, we took a week. It was announced that we were on spring break, and instead of being a week, it was going to be 2 weeks, and then we would be virtual after that. So it gave us a little bit more time to wrestle with it. You know, most organizations had to kind of work through that, but now they have those. They have those contingency plans in place, and they can work on those better. And it's good to see that in the data and what people are writing, that the risk and crisis people saying, yeah, that we're getting more resources and more attention, and we're going to be better prepared in the future. And hopefully that weight carries forward and does improve that, because it can be better the next time. You know, it can be faster, it can be more effective, and faster and more effective helps, you know, the people affected by the crisis, and it helps the organization in crisis. They both benefit from that. So yes, from what I'm seeing, at least on the business side, there seems to be a clear indication that that's the direction it's going, that there's going to be more and better preparation coming out of this.
Great, excellent, thank you.
Thanks so much. That's about, well, we're 4 minutes shy. Does anybody else have one last question or thought or a share that they'd like to toss out there? All right. Well, then we're almost up at our hour. So thank you, everybody, for popping in and joining us. So great to have you. New Zealand, Norway, US, Canada. So fantastic. And of course, Texas, having you join us, Tim. Thank you so much.
No, I enjoyed it. Great questions. It's always fun because it's good to talk about the really challenging questions, and that's what you raised. Because there are some things we know work well but a lot of times we're working in the gray area, and the more we talk about those, you know, the better we're able to handle them in the future.